You may not know this, but Elon Musk was totally inspired by the Jupiter-4 when he started SpaceX. Stay with us as we discuss. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music tech related. And what I said earlier was a total lie. Sorry, just trying to draw you in. But in all reality, this thing looks like it came out of a spaceship. So maybe there's a connection. Also, Elon Musk once tweeted about the Europa and Io moons of Jupiter, and it turns out there's actually a mod for the Jupiter-4 called the Io mod, and there's a mod for the Jupiter called the Europa mod. So maybe there's some conspiracy theory that someone can give me for how they all connect. And plus, Elon Musk hypes all sorts of stuff like stonks and Bitcoin, and you know, I love sci-fi movies and books. Why can't he love sci-fi instruments? I mean, come on. Hopefully it gives some love to analog vintage machines because they're super cool. Anyway, all that aside, today we're talking about the Jupiter-4 and asking the question, is it worth it? And again, we're going to answer that by approaching it twofold. One, from a historical standpoint and kind of a collectibility standpoint, and then two, from a sonic standpoint and relevance. Is it still a palette that's unique? Are there good modern alternatives, VSTs, etc.? So let's start with the history a little bit about the Roland Jupiter-4. And before I even get into that, we've already done a video on the Jupiter-6 and the Jupiter-8, and it surprised me that in the comments, besides telling me how bad I am and how I don't deserve to play these instruments, which I don't know if I disagree, but here I am, a number of comments on those videos were, the Jupiter-4 is by far the best. It's better than the 6. It's better than the 8. And that was interesting to me because it's the first and the original one, and it's in a lot of ways more limited than the 6 and the 8. So I was curious when I got my hands on it to play it and personally evaluate and think, okay, how does this compare? And I think the more accurate comments that I've seen below are that they're really all completely different instruments. They all share a name. They share kind of a history, but they are not that similar sonically or functionally. So let's get into it. So the Jupiter-4 was the first polyphonic synth, true polyphonic synth from Roland. There was earlier string kind of ensemble synths that were paraphonic or divide down, but this was a subtractive, true polysynth that had independent VCFs, VCA per oscillator, which the early ones did not. So this was Roland's first true polyphonic synth. And it came out in 1978. There were two versions. It was produced from the 78 to 81. Wasn't super successful, and there was two iterations of it. Actually, there's four iterations, but one really big distinction in them was the filter. So on the earlier ones, they used the BA662 filter, and then on later iterations, it was the IR3109 chip. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important later, but it had a couple versions, and it was produced for about 4 years, and it was positioned as a budget as a budget synth. At the time, there was the other polysynths. There was the Prophet 5 that had come out. There was the Yamaha CS series, the CS80, 50, 60, all of those, and the Oberheim OBX. And this was the most affordable one. It was more limited than those other synths, but it was designed to kind of come in and come at a lower price point and be more available. Again, it wasn't as successful as the 8 or the 6. I think the amount of units that were sold went up with each of those, where I think the 6, there was the most sold, and the 8 came after that. So the 4 is relatively rare, and what's unique about it is a few things. It is kind of the way I understand it, just conceptually, is it's kind of like it's before the Juno series and before the Jupiter 8, and it really has elements of both the Juno series, the Juno 6 and 60, and the Jupiter 8. It's kind of like a precursor, and really it seems like the Juno 6 and 60 and the Jupiter 8, which came out shortly after this one in '82, were it kind of forked. So the Juno 60 was the budget direction, and it had so the elements it shared that weren't found on any of the Jupiters. So there's an ensemble effect on the Jupiter-4. That's one of the things that makes it unique. And you find the chorus on the Jupiter 6 and 60. It's kind of the legendary Jupiter chorus. And it's interesting, there's no chorus or ensemble effects on the Jupiter 8 or 6. And really that was put in to kind of beef up the sound. On the Jupiter 4 and the 6, there's only a single oscillator. And so even though it's a VCO versus a DCO oscillator, the single oscillator, it's not as thick a sound as having dual oscillators per voice, which you found in some of the, like the Prophet 5 and some of the other synths of that time. So the ensemble and the chorus in the Juno 60 were a way to fatten up the sound without putting a second oscillator. With the Jupiter 8 and 6, they got the second oscillator, and so I guess they did away with the ensemble chorus effect. Interesting also is it's a stereo output, like the Juno 60. There's not a stereo output on the Jupiter 8 or 6. There's kind of a stereo output in that you can divide the upper and the lower outs to kind of create stereo-like effects. But there's not, they're mono signals, and this has an actual stereo signal with its ensemble. So other things that are unique about this, the Jupiter-4 in particular has a filter, a BA662 filter, which is found in the SH2, the SH series monosynths from Roland. And they're particularly legendary. If you've heard an SH2, we've done a video on that, and SH9. They have a very particular 70s sound, Roland 70s sound, and it's really nice. I personally really like it. People argue about whether or not you can really hear the difference between an IR 3109 and a BA 662, and that I don't know. I don't have both versions here, and but I personally like the SH monosynths quite a bit. And so one way to think about this also is kind of a polyphonic SH series Roland. And you can get tones that you get in the SH series in the Jupiter-4. It doesn't have MIDI or CV, so you have to mod it to get either of those things, which makes it really non-modern. A lot of the instruments at the time you could control via CV at least. In this case, you could not do either. Its arpeggiator does not have, you can't set how far up the keyboard it goes. It's just up mode, down mode, I think random, and up down, but you can't control how far it spans the keys. It also has some presets in it and a couple user memories, one of the earliest uses of that in a synth. And it has pretty nice bender that you can assign the VCF, VCO, or VCA control. The VCA being able to be controlled by the bender is also pretty rare to find in a Roland polysynth. They did away with that later on, and it's really cool that it's in this one. Couple other interesting things. The LFO goes into an audible range, so you can send it to the VCO, so you can do some interesting almost AM, FM basic kind of sounds. It's very, very primitive, but with it going into an audible rate, you can send it to the VCO and create some interesting sounds. The filter is self-oscillating, which is not found in the Jupiter 8. They kind of made it non-self-oscillating. And I think the Juno 60, it is self-oscillating. So again, that's kind of one of those bifurcations that elements of this found its way into certain synths and elements were eliminated or expanded upon and the Jupiter-8. And so it's a really interesting filter with the resonance, and it's kind of gritty. It's a little bit more aggressive, but it still has that kind of 70s, late 70s, early 80s sound. So it's unique in that way, and it's one of the things that distinguishes it from the Jupiter-8. It's pretty wide for its sweet spot, but it's capable of some grittiness as well, and kind of aggressive tones. It's also really easy to distort the signal path, which is also kind of unique. Later synths had controls in place so that distortion wouldn't happen as much. And it actually has a little red light that lights up when you're distorting it, but you can almost use it as an effect when you're doing patches. People talk about how that's fun and unique about this synth. And it just overall has a great, wonderful sound. It's a very, the VCOs are completely discrete, which are the 6 they were chips by that point, but this is a discrete VCOs, and so they have a certain character and a certain richness. It's got actually like manual tuning. I mean, there's no auto tune feature, and if it goes with oscillators got to tune, there's little things that you can screw on the back to tune it, which is kind of interesting. Again, it's very much more like a 70s synth that required a lot more. They were a lot more temperamental and didn't have a lot of the controls that you found in the 80s and later. So definitely quirky. Also definitely unique. It's again, I think the easiest way to think about it is it's kind of a blend of a Jupiter-8 and a Juno 60, which later got teased out into 2 separate synths. So let's take a listen, and then we'll kind of conclude with thoughts about how unique it is sonically and then collectibility. So let's take a listen. So Elon Musk's inspiration for SpaceX right here. You heard it first, Alamo Sound Lab. In all seriousness, is the Jupiter-4 worth it? In my opinion, I would say yes. I think from a collectibility standpoint, these are fairly rare. There wasn't a whole bunch of them made and sold, as they weren't super successful at the time of their initial release. But they have a pretty strong following and a lot of love in the vintage synth community. What's really interesting is that even though in the 90s they were not loved at all and you could pick them up perhaps the most cheaply, there's been a resurgence in interest over the last 20 years or so. And for a while, the Jupiter-4 was commanding higher prices than the Jupiter-6. I think that's recently changed when I looked online. It's now going for about the same, but that's, to me, very interesting because the Jupiter-4 is a lot more limited from kind of a sound standpoint, and from an architecture standpoint, it's just not as complex. It can't do as much as a Jupiter-6. But they are very different instruments, and that leads me to speak to its musicality and its uniqueness, its palette, its sonic palette. It is definitely a late 70s, early 80s synth, and it has its own kind of grit. It has a 70s grit as opposed to kind of a 90s grit that you get in like the Jupiter-6. And what I mean by that is it's dark, it's full, it's kind of dirty sounding. The Jupiter-6 is kind of cold and metallic and almost caustic. This is not necessarily an ugly grit. It's just kind of a aggressive, and it goes places with its self-oscillating filter that the Jupiter-8 doesn't. The Jupiter-8's much cleaner, much prettier, and you get just kind of this grittiness when you're using the Jupiter-4 that I think is really nice and magical. Also, there's not really modern equivalents for the Jupiter-4. Roland did do a ProMars kind of plug out that you can use, which is the ProMars with a monophonic version of the Jupiter-4 that came out around the same time. But it's not the same thing. And people have said, someone said online, and I don't know if this is true, I'm just going to throw it out there, that the reason they haven't is the VCA, the way they did the VCA in the circuitry is kind of unique on the Jupiter-4, and it's part of the reason it distorts, and that it makes it difficult to do a VST of it. Is that true? I don't know. If you know, please let me know below. But for whatever reason, nobody has done a VST as far as I can tell, and there's not any clones in the works that I know of either. So it's unique from a modern standpoint, and from a vintage standpoint, the only thing that I think is similar, you know, the Juno 60 and the Jupiter-8 are, you know, evolutions of the Jupiter-4, but they're kind of exclusive. The Jupiter-4 shares characteristics with both, and there's not really a good, there's not one, it's not really found in either of those either. So I think the Korg Poly 6 might be a comparison we do later to the Jupiter-4. It's more similar to me than either the Jupiter-8 or the Juno 60 in terms of kind of like what's in the inside and the way it's laid out and the effects and etc. So that's the only one that I can think of that's similar in some ways. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on it. What are your thoughts? Do you think it's worth it? Is it overvalued? Do you own one? Did I leave facts out? Please give us comments below. Would love to hear from you. And again, you can find us on alamomusic.com. Hit the subscribe and notification button if you haven't. Let us know what other things you'd like us to cover, what other topics, what other instruments, and we appreciate you watching. So have a great day.